In this lecture, I will be providing an overview of the politics and presidencies of the Gilded Age, as well as the rise and subsequent fall of the Populist Party or the People's Party, which will be the focus of the primary source activity for this module, and which will be part of how you take note of the larger political problems surrounding farming and just political and social trends of this time period. Alright, as I have already discussed before, the term Gilded Age is a sarcastic term coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in a magazine published called The Gilded Age in 1873, which is also during one of the many economic panics or depressions of this era. This era is often referred to as the era of forgettable presidents because it was during this time that Congress and big business began to control politics. Overshadowing the influence of the presidencies in American government, the presidencies of Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, and Harrison are largely forgotten and overlooked by the American public, which is one of the reasons that I'm actually able to cover all of these presidencies in one lecture. However, President Cleveland stands as the one exception to the rule in this period. Cleveland, who served 2 terms, non-consecutive terms, of office, made several changes that impacted America moving forward. Politically, this period was the most competitive of any other period in U.S. history. All the presidential elections during this time were very, very close, and the House of Representatives changed an impressive 6 times between 1869 and 1891 as new parties came to power. Voter turnout during this period reached its highest level in U.S. history, both before and since. And this turbulent time period made politicians very cautious. So this might be one of the reasons you have kind of forgettable presidents. They're unwilling to push back. There is no perfect tipping point in the political parties at this time. The money issue and tariff issues were 2 of the main issues dividing political parties during this time period. Republicans were generally more successful politically just because they tended to represent big business, which tended to have an edge during this time period in American history. Social issues also helped draw party lines. Republicans traced their lineage to Puritanism and stressed strict codes of personal morality and conduct. They wanted the government to implement regularity. They wanted the government to make sure that the entire society was acting in a moral way. In general, Republicans were the middle-class WASPs, again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who supported businessmen over laborists or union people. Republicans gained much of their support from the Midwest and small rural towns in the Northeast, as well as African Americans. The party emphasized the identity of interest belief and held that people should simply accept their place in society because the wealthy know what's best for the country. Republicans also supported the GRA, or the Grand Army of the Republic, which made up several thousand Union vets from the Civil War. The GRA was a politically influential fraternal organization during this time period. Democrats, on the other hand, were largely immigrant, German, Lutherans, and Catholics, especially Irish. These religions stressed less stern values of human weakness. As a result, the party in general was more supportive of social reforms, so very much leaning towards the social gospel movement. Democrats opposed government efforts to impose a single morality based on a standardized society. They supported the party largely came from the New South and large industrial cities where immigrants factored in very significantly into politics. Democrats emphasized economic equality, and they were generally opposed to prohibition, again, mostly immigrants who wanted their alcohol, but they were in favor of education, both issues that became intense issues of debate at the local level. As we discussed previously, this period of time was noted for its corruption and bribery, was central to politics and patronage. During this time, government employment expanded significantly, especially with the rise of the Postal Service, and overall, civil service reform during this period was largely anti-Irish. Alright, so Ulysses S. Grant was the most popular figure to emerge from the Civil War. He appeared non-political, appealing to voters who had grown tired of the, quote, typical politician of the time period. During the presidential election of 1868, Grant was nominated as the Republican candidate on the platform of continued military reconstruction. Those who supported Grant during his campaign started the Waving the Bloody Shirt movement in an attempt to show the loyalty of Grant to the Union cause in the Civil War, losing some support among Southern whites and Democrats. The Democrats selected Horatio Seymour, who denounced military reconstruction and the so-called Ohio idea, as their presidential nominee. However, Seymour's refusal to support the Ohio idea would lead to his downfall in the elections. The Ohio idea was the response to issuing of war bonds from the Civil War. Wealthy Easterners were demanding that federal bonds issued during the war be redeemed in gold, despite being purchased with badly depreciated paper greenbacks. In response, poor Midwestern delegates called for a reparation or a disallowance of demanding redemption of bonds in greenbacks to the max extent. Possibly, the Ohio idea hoped to keep more money in circulation, making loans less costly and easier to find. This issue over currency dominated the 1868 election and the politics of the 1870s moving forwards. As a result of this dispute over the Ohio idea, Grant defeated Seymour 214 to 280 in the Electoral College, but only won by about 300,000 votes in the popular election, which isn't that much. Freedmen, or recently freed slaves, gave Grant the presidency with about 500,000 votes. As Grant presided over an era of U.S. history that saw both unprecedented growth and unbelievable corruption, both inside and outside his own administration, you'll see that this era definitely was correctly termed the Gilded Age. As we discussed previously in the last lecture, Jim Fish and Jay Gould were among the corrupt business leaders of this time period. Together, the two tried to corner the market on gold in 1869. They persuaded Grant to order the Federal Treasury to stop selling gold. Then they began to bid the price of gold upward exponentially. The Treasury finally released gold and the bubble burst in 1869 with devastating results, almost similar to the massive stock market crash of 1929 or the 1930s. Congressional inquiry into the issue found that President Grant did not act illegally, merely recklessly, and he was not tried. The Tweed Ring in New York City was also typifying of this time period. Led by boss William Marcy Tweed, or simply Boss Tweed, Tweed used bribery and fraudulent elections to squeeze money out of New York City while running notorious political machines known as Tammany Hall, a political organization which formed in 1789 in opposition to the Federalist Party and often mirrored the views of the local Democratic Party. The power of Tammany Hall, lasted through the 1940s and into World War II, 1945, until the organization was rendered extinct in 1966. Boss Tweed was eventually exposed by the New York Times in 1871 and subsequently denounced in the media, most famously in the cartoons of Thomas Nast. Samuel Tilden prosecuted Tweed and sent him to jail, where he died, paving the way for Tilden's presidential nomination in 1876. Following Tweed was the so-called Whiskey Ring, involving a group of distillers in St. Louis. It was revealed in 1875 by the press. The ring had actually robbed millions in tax revenues from the American government by miscounting the number of kegs to cut tax costs. President Grant responded by stating, quote, "Let no man escape," but one of his own cabinet members was implicated in the scandal. Grant eventually persuaded the jury not to convict him. Even the Secretary of War proved corrupted during this time period. Secretary Belknap received $24,000 for selling the privilege of selling supplies to Native Americans, so basically he took a bribe. Supplies that were often worthless, the House voted to impeach him, and he resigned the same day. So Grant's presidency and his cabinet had a lot of corruption. One of the few bright spots for Grant's cabinet, so many of whom were implicated in scandals, was his Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, you can see pictured here. Fish was responsible for reorganizing the State Department and adhered to the merit system in civil service. He also played a central role in the success of the Treaty of Washington in 1871 between the United States and Great Britain, which settled the so-called Alabama crisis. During the Civil War, Confederate ships sailing from the British port raided U.S. or Union shipping across the North Atlantic. After defeating the Confederacy in 1865, the U.S. government demanded financial compensation from Great Britain for its role in aiding and abetting the Southern Rebellion. After 5 years, the British reluctantly negotiated. In January of 1871, Fish met with John Ross, a London financier, before making arrangements with the British minister to resolve this lingering issue. The Treaty of Washington was put in place the same year, granting provisions for damages to the United States or to the Union. Fish proved central to the success of conflict resolution under Grant's administration after securing the Washington Treaty. He also averted a war with Spain by successfully persuading Grant to remain neutral in Cuba's struggle for independence. And this is actually really important because coming out of the war, we probably wouldn't have been successful in a war with Spain at that point in time. The election of 1872 was a reaction to corruption, specifically that of Grant's administration, and is to some referred to as the Liberal Republican Revolt. The Liberal Republican Party formed in direct response to Grant's corrupt policy and corrupt presidency, campaigning under the slogan, quote, "Turn the rascal out." The party nominated Horace Greeley for the presidency in 1872 with the support of Karl Schurz, a German immigrant in the 1840s who was an abolitionist and in favor of an honest government. Greeley was supported and endorsed by the Democratic Party, even though Greeley previously bashed the Democratic Party. To Democrats, Greeley seemed to be the strongest candidate available. No other prominent Democrats were willing to run against Grant. Grant would defeat Greeley 286 to 266 in the Electoral College and by almost 800,000 popular votes to be re-elected to office. However, the Liberal Republican Party's influence forced the Republican Party to reform itself, leading to the pardoning of all but 500 ex-Confederate leaders in 1872 under a General Amnesty Act and the reduction of high Civil War tariffs against the South. The bank panic of 1873 led to a global recession that lasted until 1879. Caused by the overproduction of railroads, mines, factories, and farm products, bankers made too many risky loans and investments to finance growth. Many of those loans eventually went unpaid, leading to the collapse of the banking system and nearly 15,000 businesses declaring bankruptcy. The depreciation of greenbacks or paper currency resulted in hard money advocates, those who backed gold, seeking to increase the dollar's value. In response to the crisis, the U.S. Treasury withdrew $100 million from the nation's money supply, leaving only $350 million in currency for the nation as a whole. This pleased hard money or gold advocates, but angered soft money silver advocates who wanted to increase the amount of currency in order to make credit more plentiful and ease debt, despite the impact this would have on the overall value of the dollar. This leads to the, quote, greenback issue, which was central to the political debates of this period. This issue roughly began in 1874 when, to stimulate economic growth, congressional Democrats began printing more greenbacks into circulation in response. Grant is persuaded by hard money or gold advocates to veto the bill to print even more paper money or greenbacks. Conservatives at this time feared that uncontrolled growth of the money supply would lead to massive inflation and even greater economic hardships, even though it would make it easier to pay back debt. This ongoing debate led to the Species Resumption Act of 1875, which called for the further withdrawal of greenbacks from circulation and the redemption of all paper currency in gold rather than silver at face value in 1879. Deflation resulted due to less money being available in circulation. As a result of this act, there was a worsening of the Depression, while simultaneously there was a boost to the nation's credit ranking. You have a stronger value for the dollar, but it is harder to pay back debt, and many people are in debt. So there's a strong pushback, especially by those who owe money, so debtors, against the Species Resumption Act of 1875. And the pushback is by soft money or silver advocates. The greenback issue caused soft money advocates, mainly debtors again, to push for silver as a standard for currency rather than gold. Debtors sought to cause inflation, which would increase the money supply, making it easier for them to pay their debts. But the Treasury in the early 1870s claimed silver was only 1/16 the value of gold, despite silver prices being higher at the time in the open market. In response to the Depression and resulting push for hard money advocates in politics, silver producers stopped offering silver for sale to the Treasury, and Congress stopped coinage of silver dollars in 1873, officially taking the U.S. off the bimetal standard of silver and gold. Silver from new mines in the West drove silver prices even lower, causing Westerners to decree lower silver prices as the, quote, crime of 1873. Silver mining states demanded a return of their earlier higher silver prices in order to increase inflation. Republicans refused, and President Grant maintained his hard money gold policies. Eventually, the pushback from Western states and debtors to create silver coinage led to the passage of the Bland-Allison Act of 1878. The act was a compromise between hard and soft money advocates, where the government would buy and coin between 2 and 4 million silver coins a month, but the government stuck to the legal minimum and inflation did not occur. Although the economy grew, currency and circulation didn't keep pace, resulting in lower prices. So even though there is strong pushback, eventually gold does end up back in the money supply, but it really doesn't help debtors the way they had envisioned it would. Again, responding to the government insistence on hard money, the Greenback Labor Party formed in 1878, seeking soft money or silver-based policies. The party grew to successfully elect 14 members to Congress while polling over 1 million votes. They grew to have enough influence to impact changes in Congress, having a hand in the passage of the Bland-Allison Act and influencing the election of 1878 and 1880. But after the Depression ended in 1879, the currency issue did not come back to enter center stage in politics until the 1890s, and the Greenback Party eventually faded from public stage. So I wanted to take a quick moment to review some of the names you have been and will continue to hear in terms of Gilded Age politics. These names will come up in videos as well as readings, so please beware of their usage. Stalwarts were a member of the faction of Republican Party that opposed the civil service reform policies of President Hayes and sought unsuccessfully a third presidential term for Ulysses S. Grant. The Stalwarts or regular Republicans vied with the general, more liberal half-breeds for control of the Republican Party in the 1870s and 80s. Among stalwart leaders were Roscoe Conklin of New York and Chester A. Arthur, vice president under James A. Garfield. The half-breeds, also generally part of the Republican Party, were led by James G. Blaine, a congressman who supported civil service reforms. And then lastly, the Mugwumps. They were represented by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast. The group was primarily composed of young liberal reformers who favored Reconstruction policies to help African Americans and were anti-corruption. Unfortunately, infighting in the 1870s and 80s led to this stalemate within the party and eventually its downfall. Alright, so moving along chronologically, we come to the election of 1876 and President Hayes. Supporters or stalwarts urged Grant to run for a third term in 1876, and Grant was willing to do so, but the House passed a resolution for retaining the two-term tradition, causing the Republican Party to instead nominate Rutherford B. Hayes as the candidate in a compromise. So from the very beginning, before we even run this election, there's already tension over who's going to even run for the presidency. Running in opposition to Hayes was the Democratic nominee Samuel Tilden, famous for his hand in the Boss Tweed incident and trial, which we talked about earlier. The results are somewhat surprising, and as with other elections of the period, were very close. Tilden became only one of 3 candidates to win the majority of popular votes, but lose the election following Grover Cleveland in 1888 and Al Gore in 2000. The election resulted in disagreements or a miscount. A lot of the election votes were plagued by fraud in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, leading to a commission being created to determine the election results. and eventually leading to the Compromise of 1877, in which Hayes became president in return for the withdrawal of remaining federal troops in Louisiana and South Carolina, so an end to military Reconstruction, if you remember that from the Reconstruction lecture. Republicans assured Democrats of presidential patronage and support for a bill subsidizing a southern transcontinental railroad route, and the election officially ended Reconstruction but sacrificed civil rights. So there was an exchange. You can become president, a Republican president, Mr. Hayes, but in exchange, the Democrats want a removal of troops from the South and an agreement to have a transcontinental railroad in the South. Fun fact, just so you guys know, President Hayes was born just south of Marion in Delaware, Ohio, which is my hometown. Though he's considered one of the so-called forgotten presidents, he made federal dollars available for infrastructure improvements in the South and appointed Southerners to influential posts. Because of the economic downturn following the Civil War, Western and Southern states sought to strengthen the dollar, pulling Hayes into the hard versus soft money debate. Hayes supported gold, but actually did help with the Bland-Allison Act. So just some fun facts. Rutherford B. Hayes High School is also in Delaware. Hayes was succeeded by President James A. Garfield, who unfortunately only held office for about 6 months before he was assassinated and his vice president Chester A. Arthur took office. During the election of 1880, James Garfield defeated the Democrat Winfield Hancock, both of whom were Civil War officers, to take the presidential office. But Garfield will become the second president to be assassinated in U.S. history when he was shot and killed on June 1881 by a disgruntled military officer seeking a stalwart, Arthur, to be president. His assassin, Charles Gautier, got his wish, and Chester Arthur became the 21st American president. Following the assassination, because the VP Arthur was a stalwart, it seemed stalwarts or followers of Conklin would get all the good civil service jobs. However, Garfield came to serve as a martyr for the corruption of the civil service system, and the public began to demand reform. So it actually backfired on the assassin. All of his plans went down the drain, eventually leading to the passage of the Pendleton Act of 1883. The Pendleton Act itself prohibited hiring officers based on wealth and established a merit-based system for appointing office. The act set up the Civil Service Commission to give open competition and exams for applications for posts in classified offices. Offices that were not, quote, classified by the president did remain open to a spoils system, so based off of wealth and political favor. As a result, by 1884, nearly 10% of federal offices were classified, meaning they were based on merit. It was not until the 1980s, that the system really took full effect, and about 90% of offices were classified or based on merit. The major problem with the Pendleton Act was that federal patronage from powerful office seekers was significantly reduced, thus forcing politicians to look increasingly to corporations for campaign funds. So it did have an unintended consequence of shifting how campaign funds were structured, but it did ensure that you had a merit-based system for office, which is obviously a good thing moving forward. So that brings us to the election of 1884. After President Arthur leaves office, President Cleveland, who is one of the few remembered presidents of this period, takes over following the election of 1884. James G. Blaine, the Republican nominee, faced off against the Democratic nominee Grover Cleveland. Many Republicans, despite nominating Blaine, felt that he was corrupt, and some Republicans even left the party to join the Democratic Party, dubbed mugwumps by the media and their competition, because they disliked Blaine so much. Cleveland, on the other hand, was seen as a reformer, who, as governor, stood firm against the railroad companies in New York. His platform included more honesty and efficient government. The campaign, of course, like others in the Gilded Age, was brutal. Republicans publicized Cleveland's claim of having an illegitimate child, while a New York Republican clergyman damned the Democrats as a party of, quote, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Insulting New York's significant Irish population, Blaine failed to disclaim the statement, and the nativist phase ultimately cost Blaine the crucial New York vote in the election. The result of the election, Cleveland won 219 to 182 in the Electoral College, and by about 400,000 in the popular vote. The desertion of mugwumps from the Republican Party who refused to support Blaine and the New York incident sealed Cleveland's victory. Cleveland also won the Solid South vote as the first Democrat to do so since Buchanan 28 years earlier. All right, so Cleveland's first term in office was generally met with popular support. Cleveland was a staunch supporter of laissez-faire, or the belief that the government should not be involved in the free market. Initially, Cleveland supported the cause of the mugwumps, civil and social reforms, but eventually he caved into the demands of the Democratic political machine and fired about 2/3 of the federal officers. By 1880, military pensions for Civil War veterans were being abused through loopholes that allowed able-bodied veterans to file fraudulent claims, and grew to be an issue for the presidency to address. In a bold move against the GRA, the Grand Army of the Republic, Cleveland vetoed several 100,000 new pensions and brought the issue under control, but he faced a great deal of pushback from the GRA, which was a powerful lobbying organization, and moving forward had lost the support of the vets. Tariffs became the central issue separating the Democratic and Republican parties in the 1880s. Republicans favored a high tariff, while Democrats rejected this idea. Republicans argued that high tariffs stimulated American industry and benefited all Americans, similar to kind of the trickle-down view of today. The labor movement lent some support to this idea, but faced increasing Democratic pushback. High tariffs since the Civil War had created an annual Treasury surplus amounting to $145 million by 1881. Tariffs stifled American foreign trade, 75 to 80% of which was agricultural, especially hurting the South. The high tariffs pushed up the cost for farm products, as both producers and consumers, farmers were double victims of a high tariff. Workers also faced a crunch as the rate of tariffs did not increase at nearly the rate of wages, especially during periods of economic depression. In response, Cleveland sought lowered tariffs. He thought that lower tariffs would equate to lower prices for consumer goods and less monopolistic corporations, while also ending the embarrassing Treasury surplus. In the 1887 annual address to Congress, Cleveland spent his entire speech arguing for lower tariffs. The tariff issue continued and grew to become a determining factor for the later election of 1888. Some of the landmark legislation of Cleveland's first term in office, though not wholly supported by Cleveland himself, were the Dawes Act, designed to control Indians in the West, and the Interstate Commerce Act, designed to curb railroads. Cleveland's first term in office was followed by President Harrison, yet another of the so-called forgettable presidents of the period, who came to office after the election of 1888. Again, for the 1888 election, tariffs were the primary issue. Democrats grudgingly renominated Cleveland, while Republicans chose to nominate Benjamin Harris, grandson of William H. Harrison, the 9th president of the United States. Harrison ended up defeating Cleveland by a landslide, 233 to 168 in the Electoral College, despite Cleveland having more popular votes, making only the second time in U.S. history that the candidate with the most popular votes lost the election. With the election of President Harrison, Cleveland became the first sitting president to be voted out since Van Buren in 1840. Republicans interpreted victories in the House for the first time in over a decade, and the Senate as a mandate for the tariff, and tariff subsequently increased. Under President Harrison, Thomas B. Reed, or Czar Reed, the Republican Speaker of the House, became perhaps the most powerful speaker in the history of Congress. Reed manipulated House rules to prevent Democrats from blocking key Republican legislation and presided over the, quote, billion-dollar Congress that created expensive legislature as a means of spending money to offset the surplus created by their high tariffs. Under President Harrison, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed. You'll recall this from the industrialization lecture. As was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, reinforcing the system of bimetallism. Under this act, the Treasury would approximately double the minimum amount of silver purchased under the previously Bland-Allison Act. Western pro-silver advocates agreed to support a protective tariff in return for Eastern support of a silver bill. Mining states hated limited silver purchases under the Bland-Allison Act, while Easterners were eager to increase tariffs and increase profits, but were worried about inflated currency through silver purchases. Also passed in 1890 under President Harrison was the McKinley Tariff Bill. The McKinley Tariff Bill was the Republicans' reward for supporting the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and raised tariffs to the highest peacetime level ever of 48%. The bill reduced surplus by giving a 2-cent subsidy to American sugar producers, increasing pensions to the GRA military veterans, and reduced taxes on tobacco, but raised the tariff on agricultural products, meaning that farmers were not impressed. Democrats used the tariff issue to attack Republicans, resulting in McKinley and 77 other Republican congressmen losing the 1890 midterm elections for Congress. The new Congress included 9 members of the Farmers Alliance, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture. The tariff issue, however, was replaced by the silver issue in the 1890s due to economic concerns. Farmers were increasingly pushed around by political issues such as tariffs and hard versus soft money, which directly affected their livelihoods, and as a result sought greater representation in politics, eventually forming their own political organizations to combat the platforms of the Republican and Democratic parties. An agricultural crisis emerged after the Civil War in a market that prior to the war was booming. The drop in demand of agricultural products led to falling prices. This combined with shortages of currency led to shortages in credit, making farmers unable to buy the supplies and equipment they needed. Post-Civil War also saw the rise of global agricultural competition, especially from Russia and Canada. Farmers fared poorly in the various depressions and bake panics of this period and were not being represented politically, leading to drastic rises in radicalism among desperate farmers across America. The political rise of the farmers started with the formation of the Grange, or the National Grange of the Patronage of Husbandry, organized in 1876 and operating mostly in the 1870s. The Grange provided farmers with social and educational activities such as picnic, musics, and lectures. The Grange had about 800,000 members, mostly in the Midwest and South, eventually establishing agricultural cooperatives for both consumers and producers. The Grange created grain elevators, dairies to store and process products, and cooperative stores to purchase supplies at a reduced price in an effort to combat the high prices of railroads and corporations. The Grangers, as they came to be called, were successful politically in Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, where they succeeded in regulating railroad rates and storage fees charged by railroad operators and warehouse owners. The Grange laws, the central political goals of the organization, were only limitedly successful, however. Focused on creating government control over big business in order to benefit the people, the laws were often badly written and overturned by higher courts who were influenced by big business and lobbyists. Among the so-called Grange laws was the Munn versus Illinois case in 1877, which ruled that property was subject to government regulation when said property was devoted to public interests, i.e., railroads, and the Wabash case in 1886, which effectively overturned Munn versus Illinois and resulted in the downfall of the Grange movement as a political force. The Grange movement was eventually replaced in the late 1870s by the rise of the Alliance movement. The Alliance movement was much more radical than the Grange and advocated for political reform. The first major alliance organization to be created was known as the Knights of Reliance, formed in 1877 in Texas. Eventually, the movement spread and made its roads into cotton-producing states, reaching into Midwestern states in the 1880s, and even forming a colored alliance in 1889. Like Grangers, the alliance sponsored events, political actions, government regulations on big business, and the formation of farming cooperatives, forming relationships between farmers and those with whom they did business, purchasing supplies in bulk, and then selling them at reduced prices to farmers in the organization. In 1889, the alliance met, boasting over 3 million members, demanding free silver and proposing a sub-treasury plan, or cash advances on future crops provided by the federal treasury. Many of the alliance members supported or joined the Knights of Labor, which had similar goals to the alliance. It was a labor union at the time period. but alliances in different regions varied slightly. Farmers were able to unite politically because they disagreed on key issues based on their region, west, east, and south. Though in general, most thought that crop prices were far too low, transportation costs far too high, and that the U.S. financial system had failed them, they disagreed on how to fix these problems. In the South, for example, the major concern of the alliance members was the implementation of the sub-treasury plan, calling the sub-treasury offices alongside with their demands. Under this proposed system, farmers could store grain, and the sub-treasury would loan them up to 80% of the value of the crop at a modest interest rate. This would alleviate the cash flow problem for farmers, allowing them to stabilize their debts, but the sub-treasury plan was defeated in Congress in 1890, which led the alliance to taking political matters into their own hands and forming a third political party, the People's or Populist Party. Rising out of the alliance movement, the People's Party, or more commonly the Populist Party, was formed in the early 1890s. This third political party quickly gained political influence and attracted recruits from the Farmers' Alliance and disenfranchised Southern whites. The party was successful in electing Ignatius Donnelly to Congress 3 times. A major figure in the movement, Donnelly was formerly known as a utopian author advocating for social changes and was able to elect Tom Watson to Congress in 1890, who eventually served as the running mate to Bryan in the 1896 election. The movement was pushed forwards by Mary Elise, who gave numerous speeches in 1890 denouncing the so-called Eastern establishment in Wall Street, or the national banks, who were viewed by the labor parties at the same time as being monolithic establishments responsible for keeping the producing classes poor. Elise urged farmers to produce less corn and more hay in order to enact social and political changes for themselves. Overall, the Populist Party was met with limited success as a third party and lasted only a relatively short period of time as a major political influence, mainly in the elections of 1892 and 1896. All right, a quick recap. The Populist Party began as the Grange movement in the 1870s, seeking government regulation of big business. When this failed due to a series of Supreme Court decisions in favor of corporations, the Farmers' Alliance movement began, advocating a more radical approach to the implementation of the sub-treasury plan. When the sub-treasury plan failed in Congress, the People's Party was formed, an official third political party nominating and endorsing its own presidential candidates for the 1892 and 1896 elections. The election of 1892 saw the rise of the People's Party. Democrats for the election nominated Grover Cleveland, who had been president 4 years earlier. Cleveland was now more conservative, and his law practice represented wealthy businessmen. Republicans nominated President Harrison, who championed protective tariffs, while the third party, the Populist Party, nominated James B. Weaver, a former abolitionist and general in the U.S. Union Army, who was nominated to be the Greenback Labor Party's presidential nominee in 1880. Delegates of the People's Party from organizations such as the Farmers' Alliance, Knights of Labor, Nationalist, Bellamy clubs like the Utopian author we talked about, and land and labor parties met in Omaha, Nebraska to develop the party's running platform, the Omaha Platform, written by Congressman Ignatius Donnelly. Under the Omaha Platform, the People's Party called for free and unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16:1, calling for the creation of flexible currency. They called for a graduated income tax to redistribute wealth and government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and railroad companies. Railroads are the big one. They advocated limited government grants to settlers rather than railroads, and the holding of direct elections for senators, and the standardization of the 8-hour workday, but they did not call for the implementation of the sub-treasury plan, as most of the plan had already been defeated, and this was primarily a Southern idea. Many Southerners would not support the People's Party due to racial tensions and the lack of support for the sub-treasury plan. The campaign in 1892 centered on tariff issues. The epidemic of strikes under the presidency of Harrison had damaged Harrison politically. Harrison claimed the higher tariffs meant higher wages, but this was not the case for most workers. This, combined with the Homestead Carnegie Steel strike in 1892, led to the loss of thousands of Republican votes for Harrison. All right, so the results. Cleveland defeated Harrison 277 to 145 in the Electoral College, and the Populists won over 1 million votes and a surprising 22 electoral votes for Weaver, becoming one of only a handful of third-party groups in U.S. history to win electoral votes. For Populists, support came primarily from Colorado, Kansas, Idaho, Nevada. Note the states on the slide. Though they did not win the presidency, Populists succeeded in electing 3 governors, 5 senators, and 10 representatives, electing about 15,000 candidates to office overall. But the Populist Party was not as successful at winning Southern votes, where the Solid South refused to desert the Democratic Party for fear of losing political power over blacks, who claimed more than 1 million members in a segregated Colored Farmers Alliance. Cleveland's second term in office was during the heart of the 1893 panic, from 1893 to about 1897, and his term was plagued by the depression that followed and lasted till the end of his presidency. The panic was the worst depression of the century and was the first large-scale depression in the new urban industrial age. 20% of Americans were unemployed in the winter of 1893 to 1894, rivaling the later Great Depression of the 1930s. And an estimated 8,000 businesses collapsed in a 6-month period, including dozens of smaller railroad companies. The immediate cause of the depression was the collapse of the stock market, but the depression had been building for years prior to this collapse. Overbuilding of railroads, heavy loans to farmers, and over-speculation of profits combined with a reduced money supply and a gradual European withdrawal from American investments contributed to the collapse. The hard versus soft money arguments had damaged U.S. credit abroad and caused European bankers to call in their loans. The labor strikes under Harrison disputed economic production and continued with the already existing agricultural depression to create a deficit. Gold reserves fell below 100 million, the safe minimum for the time period to support outstanding paper currency, leading to increased silver purchases by the government. In response to this economic crisis and return to a gold standard, Cleveland repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, despite leading populist William Bryan arguing against the decision. The decision alienated the Democratic civil rights, or those supporting soft money, and divided the party, again, debating between hard and soft money. The economic concerns grew so dire that in February of 1894, the gold reserve sank to 41 million, putting the U.S. in danger of going off the gold standard altogether, as the Treasury was unable to back the greenbacks or the paper money in circulation with gold. If the U.S. went off the gold money standard, they would be volatile and unreliable in terms of international trade. To address this issue, Cleveland sold government bonds for gold and deposited the proceeds in the Treasury, but his scheme failed, and the downward spiral of U.S. currency continued. Finally, in 1895, desperate to address the currency issue, Cleveland persuaded J.P. Morgan and other bankers to lend the U.S. government about $65 million in gold. In exchange, the bankers received a commission of $7 million. The Morgan bond transaction, as it came to be known, was successful. Half the gold was to be purchased abroad and deposited in the Treasury. The plan restored confidence in the nation's finances for a short term, but economic concerns regarding gold and silver would continue to be a concern for Cleveland and later presidents in the Gilded Age, and it would actually greatly tarnish his second term in office. Cleveland's second term in office was followed by President McKinley and the historic election of 1896. Republicans nominated William McKinley, an ex-congressman from Ohio. McKinley was backed by Marcus Hanna, an iron tycoon who had bailed McKinley out of a $100,000 obligation. Hanna believed that the function of government was to aid business and believed that prosperity, quote, trickled down to the laboring classes. Hanna was heavily criticized for his idea among labor unions and the Populist Party, but was able to raise significant campaign funds to the tune of about $3.5 million, compared to only $300,000 for the Democratic nominee. Overall, the Republican platform supported the gold standard or hard money, but advocated bimetallism based around worldwide silver standard, really in order to shame other nations to agree to a silver standard. The platform also advocated for a protective tariff. Again, usually a northern Republican type candidate who supports big business is going to want a high tariff. For the Democratic Party, William Jennings Bryan was nominated. Democrats refused to endorse Cleveland for his silver purchase repeal of that act, the Pullman strike, and the Morgan bond deal. These actions proved suicidal for the Democratic Party in the 1896 elections. Cleveland left office an extremely unpopular man in American politics. Bryan, a 36-year-old from Nebraska, was the premier orator of his day, which means he gave a lot of speeches, and the first politician of his generation to lead a majority party as a champion for the poor. But previous actions under Cleveland had tarnished the Democratic Party's support nationwide. Known for his famous Cross of Gold speech given at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Bryan again advocated for the unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16 to 1, 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. Stating at the convention, "We will answer their demands for a silver standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Under the 16 to 1 ratio, silver $1 and coins could be worth about 50 cents. Bryan, due in part to this support of silver coinage, was also supported by the Populist Party. But Bryan did not acknowledge the Populist nomination early enough in the campaign and did not fully take advantage of that opportunity. As the campaign progressed, the Populist Party was froze out of the race, and the Democratic Party embraced their 16 to 1 silver coinage platform, causing the party to simply endorse Bryan rather than submit the hard money McKinley candidate. During the course of the 1896 campaign, Bryan forced the silver issue to the forefront despite Hanna and McKinley seeking to focus on tariffs. Hanna waged a high-pressure campaign against silver, while McKinley himself remained in Ohio for his front porch campaigns. Bryan was defeated as a result of the middle class coming to see him as a threat to their way of life. Here you just see the two pictures. So the 1896 election is very important to the Populist Party's history. William Jennings Bryan runs multiple times but is never elected. And then William McKinley, who actually won the election in this case. The results: McKinley defeated Bryan 271 to 176 in the Electoral College. McKinley won the Northeast and North, while Bryan won the South and West, with the exception of California and Oregon, if you look at the map. The campaign was the most significant election in the U.S. since Lincoln's victory, and marked the last serious effort by a major party to win the White House with rural votes. The Populists and Democrats failed in part because there were not enough farmers to constitute a majority vote. Republicans, who hold the White House for 16 consecutive years, contributed to diminished voter participation as the Republican Party came to be seen as the party of the rich, controlling big business and corporations. The election marked the start of the fourth party system. Large population centers grew to determine elections. Farmers became discouraged and less politically active as a result. The influence of rural areas politically fell after 1896. African American rights were abandoned by the Republican Party since the African American vote in the South was not important in the 1896 election, a trend that continued for the next several presidential elections to follow. So McKinley's presidency overall. McKinley was the 25th President of the United States. He served from March 1897 until his assassination on September 14, 1901, after leading the nation to victory in the Spanish-American War and raising protective tariffs to promote American industry. McKinley's presidency was marked by the Dingley Tariff Bill passed in 1897, which was created to recover lost revenues. The bill raised the tariff rate to 46.5 from 41.3, and the Gold Standard Act of 1900, which was passed after the Silver supporters left Congress in 1900 and called for the redemption of paper money in gold. Again, he is a pro-business, pro-hard money, high-tariff candidate. Under McKinley's presidency, moderate and necessary inflation from the rapidly expanding economy occurred. In the 1880s and 1890s, prices were still depressed, Money was tight, and the volume of currency in circulation lagged far behind increasing volume of business. Silver proved to be too radical of a solution to the economic concerns of the nation. Fortunately for hard money advocates, new gold discoveries in Canada, Alaska, and South Africa and Australia helped to keep the gold standard alive. But silver versus gold would continue to be a concern for America moving forwards. Alright, so the legacy of populism. So populism ultimately failed as a third-party cause, but had a political influence for 25 years or more after its defeat in the 1896 election. Some of the populist ideas that carried into the progressive era of the 1900s to the 1920s included railroad legislation, a graduated income tax, the direct election of senators, initiative referendum and recall, which has to do with local voting rights, the sub-treasury plan. All of these ideas were geared towards rural life, yet many of its ideas appealed to urban progressive movement reformers in the 1900s. So here we just have a list of the presidents we covered so far in the course. I ran through many of their elections and presidencies very quickly in this lecture, but I wanted you to have kind of a list in mind while we go forward in the class. Again, this period was the period of, quote, forgettable presidents, so I was able to run through a lot of them fairly quickly, but you'll want to remember some of their major achievements as we move forward in the course, especially of some of the names that aren't as forgettable, like Cleveland, or Lincoln, or Johnson. Alright, so really quickly, as we wrap up this lecture, some questions to consider, some things that you should be pretty confident with answering at this point in the week. Can you analyze the factors that led to the rise of the populist movement? So can you talk about the Grain to the Farmers Alliance and then eventually that third party? To what extent were populists successful in achieving their goals by 1900? What did they achieve in the 1892 and the 1896 election? What were their aims? Why were they running as a third party? Did they meet any of those aims? So all things to think about as we go into our next discussion.